everybody. Try to do a summary of chapter 10 for the Autobiography of Malcolm X as told through Alex Haley. Title of chapter 10 is Satan. Chapter starts off talking about the word concurrently. Malcolm and Shorty were sentenced to several 8 to 10 year sentences that were intended to be served concurrently. Concurrently means that all the sentences are served together. So they were sentenced to 10 years of heavy labor. Malcolm talks about Shorty reading Revelations for some reason. They were sentenced in Middlesex County. Malcolm and Shorty got 10 years. The girls got 1 to 5 years. I think they ended up getting or serving 2 or 3 years. The girls, that is. They were sentenced in February 1946. He was 20 years old at this time. Quote, I wasn't quite 21. I had not even started shaving, unquote. He was sentenced to Charleston State Prison. About his time in jail, he says, quote, behind bars, a man never reforms. He will never forget. He will get completely over the memory. He never will get completely over the memory of the bars, end quote. He talks about being a fish, which is another term for a new inmate in jail, prison term. This is an old prison that was built in 1805. Said that the toilet was a covered pot or a covered pail. Sorry. He said, quote, can't stand having to smell a row of defecation, end quote. His first letter came from what he says is a religious brother in Detroit. I don't think it said who exactly that was. Ella was the first person to visit him. He found out in jail how to get a small high from drinking nutmeg mixed with water. He's eventually able to buy weed from the guards. In total, Malcolm served 7 years in prison. I think it was almost 7 years, but okay, 7 years. Malcolm was disorderly in prison. He was throwing things, cursing out guards, and refusing to answer. When the guards or people of authority wanted questions or answers from him, he would refuse to answer. He liked to be in solitary. He would curse the Bible and God. The people in prison came to call Malcolm Satan, and that's where the title comes from, for his, quote, anti-religious attitude. The first positive inmate he talks about is a guy named Bimby. Malcolm met Bimby in 1947. He's approximately 22 years old. They met while working in the license plate line, while doing labor in the license plate line. Bimby was known for his good conversation. Malcolm says, quote, the guards would walk close to hear Bimby, end quote. They regarded Bimby as, quote, the library's best customer, end quote. Malcolm was fascinated with Bimby. He says, quote, what fascinated me with him most of all was that he was the first man I had ever seen command total respect with his words, end quote. Bimby crushed Malcolm's atheist concept. Bimby recommended Malcolm to take classes and to go to the library. Malcolm dropped out of school in the 8th grade, and that was after Mason Junior High. That was his last formal education. His sister Hilda recommended that Malcolm study English and penmanship, learn how to write better. He starts to order books from the library based on these recommendations. A year later, Malcolm starts writing better and began studying Latin to understand word derivations. He was trying to understand the root meaning of words and where words came from and how they evolved. Malcolm was in jail when Jackie Robinson went to the Brooklyn Dodgers. This is April 1947. He's still 21 years old at this time. He says he became the biggest Jackie Robinson fan. In 1948, Malcolm was transferred to Concord Prison His brother Filbert writes and tells him, quote, the natural religion for the black. His brother Filbert writes to him and tells him that he found, quote, the natural religion for the black man. His brother Reginald tells him, quote, don't eat pork, don't smoke cigarettes. I'll show you how to get out of prison, end quote. Malcolm thought it was some kind of trick, but all he cared about was the statement, get out of prison. He stopped smoking cigarettes and eating pork immediately. He says, quote, if you take one step toward Allah, Allah will take 2 steps towards you. All his brothers and sisters were converted to Islam. I think Ella was the only one that was resistant to it. Since Reginald had the closest relationship with Malcolm, the family felt that Reginald would be the best to convince Malcolm to practice Islam. Ella helped Malcolm to get transferred to a better prison. His older sister Ella helped Malcolm get transferred to a better prison. It was in Norfolk, Massachusetts, 1948. He felt the new prison was, quote, comparatively heaven, end quote. Much better prison, much better situation, but he's coming from a very rough situation. A prison built in 1805 with buckets, as the toilet. So it's, Regarding the prison at Norfolk, Malcolm says, quote, Norfolk prison colony represented the most enlightened form of prison that I had ever heard of, end quote. They would have visits from teachers from Harvard and Boston. Prison had a very good library, specialized in history and religion. He says, quote, I read aimlessly until I learned to read selectively with a purpose. So at first he was just going to the library, reading anything that he could. And then once he started to understand better, he would determine a direction. Reginald visits him and tells him, quote, God is man. And there are 360 degrees of knowledge. About this, Malcolm says, quote, if someone is trying to put you on to something, you need to listen, end quote. He says the devil only has 33 degrees of knowledge. And he talks about masonry having 33 degrees. God came to America and made himself known to Elijah Muhammad. He says, quote, the devil's time is up, end quote. He also learns that the devil is a man, the white man. This is what the book says. Malcolm thinks about the white people he knew in the past, the people in the state that were trying to break up his family, the ones that were trying to call his mother crazy, the Swirlins, his teacher, Mr. Ostrowski. He considered most of them devils. He talks about a 33-degree Mason, and Malcolm asked about, he talks to a 33-degree Mason, yeah. And Malcolm asked the Mason about 360 degrees versus 33 degrees. And he says, quote, he got no satisfactory answer, end quote. Reginald visits him again and talks about how the white man has, quote, brainwashed the black man, end quote. Reginald believed, quote, the white man's world was on its way down, on its way out, end quote. He says, quote, you have been cut off by the devil white man from all true knowledge of your own kind, end quote. Malcolm began to receive 2 letters a day from his brothers and sisters in Detroit. They were now followers of, quote, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, unquote, a black man who was the messenger of Allah. Elijah Muhammad was born in Georgia and moved to Detroit, where he met Wallace D. Fard, quote, God in person, end quote. Malcolm's brothers and sisters wanted Malcolm to be a follower of Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm's brothers and sisters wanted Malcolm to be a follower of Elijah Muhammad. They taught him that Islam is the submission and atonement of one toward Allah. He was taught that the original man was black on the continent of Africa, building empires while whites were still in caves. Kidnapping Africans was human history's greatest crime. Africans had been cut off from their past. He says, quote, the slave master forced his family name on this rape mixed race, which the slave master began to call the Negro, end quote. blacks had been taught that the Africans were heathens, and they were swinging from trees like monkeys. Malcolm believed the slave master injected his Christian religion and concept of the blue-eyed God on blacks in America, or the slaves that they brought over. He says that blacks were taught that black itself is a curse. He says that he wouldn't go back to his former life. He says that once he found out about this information, he can never go back to his former life. He talks about, he makes a reference to Paul being enlightened on his way to Damascus, and how he could never go back to his original path, and he became a disciple of Jesus or the Christ. So that's what he compares this time to. He says the truth can only be learned by a sinner who admits guilt. Quote, the one who Jesus couldn't help were the Pharisees. They didn't feel they needed any help, end quote. At this time, Reginald goes back to Detroit. Malcolm at this time is only drinking water, and he's barely eating. His sister Hilda came to visit him and told him to write to Elijah Muhammad. She told Malcolm about the origins of man, and Yaqub's creation of the white man. She tells him that Yaqub had a large head. He was exiled with 59,999 other people to the island of Patmos. Yaqub creates the white. Their Yaqub creates the white race. They stay there. Yaqub knew that there were two germs in the black man, a black and a brown, and the brown was a recessive gene. He made the people progressively lighter. Yaqub died at the age of 192, and after 200 years of this recessive breeding, there were no blacks and there were only browns. After another 200 years, there were no browns and only reds. After another 200 years, there were only reds. There were no reds and only. Did it go from red to white? It's supposed to go from red to yellow, and then another 200 years from yellow to white. After 600 years of the newly created white people having isolation, they had isolation for 600 years, and after that they came back to the blacks and caused blacks to fight within 6 months. This is what Malcolm's sister Hilda is telling him about the story of Yaqub. It says the white devil was chained and sent to Europe. After 2,000 years in caves, Moses from the Bible leads them to civilization. This race would rule for 6,000 years. He makes a reference to the passage where Moses lifts the serpent in the wilderness. This is Numbers. This is in the Bible, Numbers chapter 21, verse 9. Malcolm says, quote, it was written that some of the original people should be brought as black slaves to North America to learn to better understand at first hand the white devil's true nature in modern times, end quote. He's taught by Elijah Muhammad that the mightiest God was Master W.D. Fard. Fard was a half black, half white man. Elijah Muhammad met Master W.D. Fard in 1931 and got the message to save the Negroes in America. Hilda left after telling Malcolm about the Yaqub story. Malcolm says that the tales like Yaqub infuriated Muslims in the East. Malcolm says it was their fault as well. Their silence on what Islam was to them left a vacuum here in America that, quote, any religious faker, end quote, would be able to mislead our people. And that is the end of chapter 10. And I'll see y'all in chapter 11. MalcolmXFoundation.org if you'd like to make a donation. Share this video, and y'all take it easy, man. God bless.